I never thought a flimsy piece of paper could split my world in half. But the night I found that hotel receipt, crumpled, smelling faintly of perfume and cigarette smoke, my hands shook like I was holding a death notice. Room 412, Hyatt Regency in downtown Chicago. Friday night, 2 glasses of Chardonnay, one king bed. It wasn't set mine. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. I sat there at the kitchen table in our Oak Park home, the autumn rain hitting the window in uneven taps, like God himself was hesitating to break the silence. 25 years of marriage. One mortgage, one son, grown and off at college. One house built on loyalty and grease-stained knuckles. And now one receipt that whispered everything I didn't want to know. Before I go further, let me pause here. If you've ever had your life detonated by betrayal, you'll understand the pit in my stomach. And if you're new here, before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. I share these stories not because they're easy to tell, but because silence protects the guilty. When she walked through the door that night, hair damp from the drizzle, I asked her the simplest question in the world. How was your Friday? Her eyes flickered. Not long, not dramatic, just half a second too quick. She kissed my cheek, set her purse down, and answered, "Late meeting. You know how Richard is." Richard, her boss. A man with cufflinks that glimmered like shark teeth, and a smile you could never quite trust. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But the receipt on the table between us said otherwise. She didn't notice it then. I had slipped it under the bills, a mechanic's habit, hiding the one broken bolt among the parts until I was ready to confront it. My fingers traced the $228 charge, the underlined date October 14th, 2022. My birthday weekend. Happy birthday, Kevin. Here's Sep's your gift. I went out to the garage that night, sat in front of the Chevy Bel Air my father left me, half restored, dust coating its hood. The bourbon glass in my hand felt heavier than the steel of that car. I thought about every sacrifice, selling overtime hours to make her vacations happen, patching roofs while she ordered dresses for work events, swallowing my pride when she joked about my oil-stained hands in front of her friends. And then I thought about the number, $228. Not even extravagant. Not even grand. Just careless. Like she couldn't bother hiding it better. The rain grew louder, hammering the garage roof. My phone buzzed. My sister Elaine. She always called on Fridays. I almost let it go to voicemail, but when I answered, my voice cracked, and before I knew it, I was telling her about the receipt. She didn't gasp. She didn't ask if I was sure. She just said, "Kevin, you've always been the honest one. Don't let them make you doubt that." Her words stung. Because the truth is, I already doubted myself. Was I too old? Too boring? At 52, polishing carburetors while her world sparkled with glass offices and catered lunches, maybe I had become the man she didn't want to introduce anymore. But when I looked back at that receipt, at that underlined date, that Hyatt address, that empty betrayal typed in black ink, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't about age, or boredom, or ambition. This was about respect. Saturday morning, I tested her. I asked casually, "So where was the meeting yesterday? Downtown?" She didn't miss a beat. "Yeah. Late night, lots of numbers," Richard insisted. Numbers. She wasn't wrong. I had the numbers right in front of me. Later that weekend, I slipped into her purse while she showered. Don't judge me, you would have done the same. That's when I found it, a text notification still glowing on the screen. Friday was perfect. Aspen next? Initials RC Richard. Of course. I screenshotted it, emailed it to myself. Then I opened the drawer where the receipt lay folded. I slid both into a plain manila envelope. Evidence, not for divorce lawyers yet, for myself, to prove I wasn't crazy. The house felt colder after that. Every clink of her wine glass, every new pair of heels she bought, every late return home. It all echoed against the silence of my certainty. She was gone, even as she sat across from me. Sunday night, as she scrolled her phone and smiled faintly at something unseen, I realized something. If she could betray me in silence, then I could plan in silence too. But I wasn't planning heartbreak songs or therapy sessions. No. My plan would be methodical, surgical, and it would strike at the very heart of her new fantasy world. Because you see, that company she thought Richard owned, it wasn't the fortress she imagined. I had overheard enough fragments, seen enough stress lines around her eyes to know his empire wasn't as stable as the cufflinks suggested. And if Richard was the castle she wanted to climb into, maybe it was time I learned how castles really fall. By Monday morning, I had already called in a favor from an old customer at the garage who now worked in investments. Just coffee, I said. Just curiosity. But as I scribbled notes on napkins about shares, board votes, and controlling stakes, my mind wasn't on cars anymore. It was on revenge. Not the cheap kind, not the dramatic shouting in the kitchen kind. No, the kind that burns slow, that signs its name on contracts. That doesn't just win arguments, it changes ownership. I set the bourbon glass down, stared at my reflection in the Chevy Sips chrome bumper, and made myself a promise. They took my marriage like it was disposable. I settle take their empire, and I settle make them watch it crumble. And for the first time since finding that receipt, I smiled. Grief doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just hums in the background, like the dull buzz of a fluorescent light that won't quite die. For me, that hum was the silence of my garage. The Chevy Bel Air sat there under a tarp, half finished, half forgotten. Dust traced my fingerprints from nights when I'd polish one corner, promising myself I'd finish it next summer. That car wasn't just metal and bolts, it was my father's legacy. He had worked the steel mills in Gary, Indiana, and when he passed, he left me that Chevy saying, "Kevin, a man should always keep something worth restoring, even when the world falls apart." That night, the world had fallen apart. I spread bills across the workbench like a dealer setting down bad hands. Mortgage due, property tax notice, health insurance premium climbing, all the while. Her laughter from upstairs, muted, clipped, like she was texting someone who made her feel alive in a way I apparently never did. The bourbon burned my throat, but it was easier than letting the tears run freely. I wanted to scream, but instead I whispered into the garage air, was I never enough? I kept whispering it, as if the Chevy or the oil-stained walls might answer. That's when the door creaked. She walked in late, perfume still clinging to her scarf, eyes tired, but not from work. She froze, seeing the bills. "Where have you been?" I asked. Her face didn't flinch. She tossed her scarf on a stool and snapped. "Kevin, I said I'm tired of scraping by. Some men build empires. You polish old cars." Her words hit harder than the receipt. The man I was loyal, steady, stubborn, collapsed right there. I didn't argue, didn't shout. I just stared at her, memorizing the curl of her lip when she said it. That was the night I realized she wasn't just cheating with Richard. She was cheating on our life, on everything we built. After she went to bed, I drove to a 24-hour diner. Elaine, my sister, slid into the booth across from me. No questions asked. I pushed the hotel receipt across the table. She read it once, then set it down like it was radioactive. "Kev," she whispered, her hand covering mine, "she doesn't get to define your worth. You built a life. You built loyalty. If she can see it, that seps on her." I shook my head. Maybe she sips right. Maybe I was never enough. Tears rolled down my cheeks before I could stop them. Elaine squeezed my hand tighter. "No. Dawn set. Give her that power." Her words stitched me together, if only slightly. On the drive home, I passed the Hyatt, where the receipt was printed. Room 412, October 14th, my birthday. The neon lights reflected on my windshield like ghosts. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. Something hardened inside me. Back in the garage at dawn, I lined up the manila envelope with the receipt, the screenshot, and the notes I had scribbled. It looked pathetic, like scraps, but it was a beginning. She came down in the morning, sipping coffee, scrolling her phone. She didn't even notice the grease on my hands trembling as I held the cup. To her, I was invisible. But invisibility has its advantages, because invisible men can move in silence. That day I went through my father's old metal cabinet. Inside was the deed to his land, 60 acres near Springfield, untouched, farmland worth more than it looked. Selling it would feel like betrayal to him. But maybe it was the only way to fight the bigger betrayal unfolding right under my roof. I set the deed on the workbench and whispered, "Dad, I'm sorry, but I swear I shall make this worth it." When she left for work, I followed, not close, not suspiciously, just enough. She drove straight to Richard's downtown office. Not a surprise. But when I saw her touch his arm in the parking garage, laughing like a girl in her 20s again, something in me broke clean in half. That was the last time I cried. The garage became my war room. The bills, the deed, the receipts. They weren't signs of collapse anymore. They were weapons waiting to be sharpened. I wasn't just a man with oil on his hands. I was about to become the man who turned their empire into dust. And when she mocked me, some men build empires. You polish old cars. She didn't realize I had just found the blueprint for hers to collapse. I closed the garage door, sealed the world out, and said it out loud this time, strong enough for the Chevy to hear, "They chose greed. I'd sell choose justice." And when I septum done, she one day recognized the man she tried to throw away. The garage had always been my refuge, but after that night it became something else. A war room. The smell of old oil and rust mixed with the sharp sting of bourbon, and every creak of the rafters felt like a clock ticking down to the moment I would strike. Silence can either destroy you or shape you. For me, it became the crucible. In silence, I could think. In silence, I could build. I started with the manila envelope. Inside, the receipt from the Hyatt, the screenshot of her texts with Richard, a few scribbled notes about dates, times, and addresses. But if I was going to take them down, I needed more than scraps. I needed something solid, something undeniable. I reached out to an old customer, a man named Frank, who used to bring his BMW to my garage. Frank was a mid-level accountant then, but I remembered him saying he had moved into corporate auditing. We met at a quiet coffee shop on a Tuesday morning. I told him I was looking into investing. Frank smirked. "Funny, Kevin, you've always been about grease and engines, now you've talking shares?" I shrugged, forcing a laugh. "Times change." He leaned in. "You looking at Richard Cole Sipsid's outfit? Because if you are, you better know it's not as bulletproof as he makes it sound." My heart ticked faster. I sipped my coffee and asked carefully, "What do you mean?" Frank lowered his voice. "Rumors of cooked books, deferred payments." He sips leveraged up to his neck. Anyone paying attention can see it. I nodded, keeping my face calm. Inside, though, I was already wiring connections together like spark plugs firing in perfect sequence. If Richard's empire was crumbling, it meant one thing: it could be bought. That night, I sat in the garage and spread out documents like blueprints. My father's land deed, my inheritance papers, my savings statements. Numbers lined up like chess pieces. $380,000 inheritance, $320,000 if I sold the land, $50,000 in savings, roughly $750,000 in total. Enough to matter, enough to hurt. I whispered it like a prayer. A man doesn't just fight back. He invests in his revenge. The next step was evidence. Not just against her, but against him. Because if I was going to pull this off, I couldn't just be a jealous husband. I had to be a man with proof. I hired a private investigator. Cash, no paper trail. His name was Donnelly, an old-timer with a limp and a fedora that made him look like he'd stepped out of a black-and-white film. We met at a diner off I-55. "Follow her," I said, sliding him a photo of my wife. And him. I don't need gossip. I need dates, times, places, paper, photos. Donnelly tapped his pen against the table. "You want the kind of evidence that holds up in court or just enough to break her heart?" "Both," I said flatly. He nodded, pocketed the photo, and left without another word. A week later, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside were photos her and Richard at a hotel bar, her hand grazing his arm in ways mine hadn't felt in years, the two of them slipping into an elevator together. Alongside the photos was a transcript of texts Donnelly had pulled. "Aspen is ours. Don't worry, he's too blind to notice." I didn't slam my fist. Didn't break things. I just slid the photos into my growing manila envelope and underlined the date. November 2nd, 2022, evidence layered like sediment, each piece burying my old life a little deeper. Meanwhile, I started attending shareholder information sessions. I blended into the back of small rooms, listening to men in suits drone about dividends, liabilities, quarterly earnings. At first, I didn't understand half of it, but I learned. Night after night, I scribbled in a notebook, diagrams and numbers filling the pages. And as I learned, I realized something chilling. Richard wasn't a king. He was a gambler playing with other people's chips. His empire looked big, but the foundation was crumbling. In the quiet hours past midnight, I stared at the Chevy's chrome bumper and saw my reflection staring back, eyes harder, jaw set. I wasn't just the man she mocked anymore. I was becoming something else. Elaine noticed too. She came by one evening, worried about me. "You cert not drinking as much," she said softly. "That sip's good, but you cert different. What are you doing, Kevin?" I smiled faintly. "Fixing a problem." She tilted her head, searching my face. "Just don't lose yourself in the process." But losing myself had already happened. The man polishing old cars had died with that receipt. What lived now was someone sharper. Someone willing to sell a father's land, risk every penny, and buy the ground out from under their feet. By mid-November, I had the numbers, the evidence, the will. All that remained was to act. On the last night of the month, I placed the deed on the workbench beside the photos. I pressed my hand against the yellowed paper, and for a moment I could almost hear my father Sips's voice again. A man should always keep something worth restoring. I whispered back, "I will, Dad. But first I have to destroy what they built on my name." The garage light flickered, humming faintly. I took it as a sign. The silence had shaped me. Now it was time to move. Revenge isn't a single swing of the hammer. It's the tightening of screws, the quiet turning of gears, the slow buildup of pressure until the whole machine explodes. By late November, I had stopped asking myself if I would do it. The question had become how fast. The first step was selling my father's land. 60 acres of soil outside Springfield, land that smelled of corn husks and sweat when I was a boy. My father had bled into that dirt, and selling it felt like peeling off my own skin. But every time doubt threatened me, I pictured her laugh echoing down the Hyatt hallway, Richard's cufflinks glinting as he pulled her closer. That image hardened my resolve. I met with a realtor named Harris, a no-nonsense man with rimless glasses who had handled farmland transactions for decades. We sat in his office, the air heavy with the scent of old paper. "You'll get around 320,000, give or take," he said, running his finger down the appraisal sheet. I swallowed hard. "Do it." He raised an eyebrow. "Sure you want to sell this fast? Holiday season isn't set." I said, "Do it." My voice cracked like a wrench on rust. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked circles around the garage, whispering apologies to my father. "Dad, forgive me. This isn't greed, this is survival, this is justice." By December 2nd, the papers were signed, $320,000 wired into my account. I didn't touch it, didn't move a dime, just stared at the numbers glowing on the screen. Alongside my inheritance and savings, I now had a war chest of $750,000. Enough to shake Richard's empire if I moved carefully. The second step was learning the rules of the game. I wasn't a man in suits, but I knew engines, and companies like engines have weak points. I started meeting with a corporate lawyer, a man named Glass who specialized in shareholder rights. We met in a dimly lit office downtown, the walls lined with dusty law books. Glass peered at me over his half-moon spectacles. "You said are telling me you want to buy into Coal Dynamics? Kevin, that SIP's not a hobby stock. That SIP's a shark tank." I leaned forward. "I don't want to swim. I want to bite." He smirked, then grew serious. "Richard Cole owns about 40% through direct holdings. The rest is scattered among smaller shareholders and board members. If you can buy even 10, maybe 15% quietly, you'll have leverage. More than that, you could become a problem he can't ignore." I sat back, heartbeat steady. Then make me his problem. For the next 2 weeks, my life became a blur of documents and signatures. Every morning before dawn, I'd rise, polish a corner of the Chevy, and then dive into papers, purchase agreements, wire transfers, confidential shareholder lists that Glass obtained through careful legal requests. Each step left a paper trail, but each step was clean, lawful, unassailable. Meanwhile, upstairs, she was flaunting the rich life. Diamond earrings appeared suddenly in her jewelry box. A new leather handbag, tags still on. Aspen brochures tucked between her magazines. One night, as she poured herself a second glass of Merlot, I asked casually, "That sip's a nice necklace. Where sips you get it?" Her smile was thin, rehearsed. "Work bonus." I nodded, biting my tongue. I knew it wasn't a bonus. I had already seen Richard's name on the credit card statement Donnelly slipped me. A $4,800 jewelry store charge, dated November 28th. I kept the printout folded in my pocket like a secret weapon. Evidence. Always evidence. But watching her parade his gifts through our kitchen felt like being gutted over and over again. Each sparkle of those diamonds reminded me of the years she dismissed the grease under my nails, the birthdays I worked late to cover bills. Now she flaunted someone else's luxury under my roof. I didn't confront her, not yet, because silence was my greatest weapon. Let her believe I was blind. Let her believe I was still polishing old cars while she reached for castles. In reality, every evening I slipped into the garage to review contracts with Glass. He taught me the language of power. Terms like proxy votes, controlling stake, special meeting. At first the words felt alien, but soon I realized they were no different from parts of an engine. If you knew which bolt to loosen, the whole machine collapsed. By December 10th, I had quietly secured nearly 12% of Coal Dynamics through small shareholders who were eager to cash out before Christmas. Each transaction was legal, clean, and unnoticed by Richard. To him I was still invisible. Elaine called one night to check in. "Kev, you sound different, stronger. But what are you doing? You said are scaring me." I smiled faintly into the phone. "Don't set worry, sis. Dom just fixing something bigger than a car this time." She sighed, but she trusted me. She always had. That weekend, my wife came home flushed with excitement. She tossed an Aspen travel brochure onto the counter and said, "Richard thinks we should spend New Year sips there. Fresh snow, champagne, the works." I picked up the glossy pamphlet, studying the photos of ski lodges and candlelit dinners. My pulse didn't set, even rise. Instead, I folded the brochure neatly, set it back on the counter, and said, "Sounds nice." Her smile widened, believing my indifference was ignorance. But in that moment, I knew the truth. While she was planning Aspen, I was planning the boardroom. While she was picking out gowns, I was picking out ledgers. And when the day came, she wouldn't be sipping champagne on a snowy mountain. She'd be standing in a room full of shareholders as her lover's empire crumbled, and I held the hammer. That night I stood in the garage, staring at my father's Chevy. My reflection glimmered faintly in the chrome. "This isn't set to revenge for the sake of pain," I whispered. "This is justice, and justice requires patience." I slid the jewelry receipt into the manila envelope, underlined the date, November 28th, and sealed it shut. Every piece of paper, every signature, was a brick in the wall I was building around them. And when that wall closed in, there would be no way out. Some decisions feel like tearing your own flesh. Selling my father's land was one of them. On December 6th, I drove down to Springfield one last time. The air was brittle cold, the fields barren under a pale winter sky. I parked on the dirt road and walked the perimeter slowly, boots crunching over frozen soil. I remembered being 10 years old, riding on the tractor with my father, the smell of diesel and earth mixing in the air. He'd wipe sweat from his brow and say, "This dirt isn't just land, Kevin. It's blood turned into soil. A man leaves behind what he worked for." And here I was about to sell it. I knelt, scooped a handful of frozen earth, and let it crumble through my fingers. "I'm sorry, Dad," I whispered, "but this isn't set betrayal. This is the only way to save what you taught me to fight for." By December 8th, the land sale cleared. $319,842 wired into my account, down to the dollar printed neatly on the transfer receipt. When I saw the balance update on my phone inheritance savings land sale, it totaled just over $749,800. My war chest was complete. The next morning I walked into Glass's office carrying a leather briefcase I hadn't touched in years. Inside the bank statements, the wire confirmations, the contracts, the air smelled faintly of old books and ink, like every deal made there still lingered in the walls. Glass adjusted his glasses and tapped the papers. You realize what you said are doing, Kevin. This isn't set a repair job. This is war. I nodded. Then let's fight clean. He drew up the share purchase agreement. 87 pages of fine print. I initialed every line, signed every page, wired the money. By December 10th at 4:27 p.m., Coal Dynamics had a new minority shareholder, me, with a block of shares large enough to give me leverage Richard never dreamed I'd have. When the ink dried, I sat back in the leather chair and exhaled slowly. My entire life, every dollar I had ever saved, every acre of soil my father left behind, it was all locked in those shares. For a moment, fear rattled me. What if I lost everything? What if Richard's empire collapsed before I could strike? What if my wife left me anyway, laughing as I held worthless paper? But then I remembered her words. Some men build empires. You polish old cars. I smiled. She was about to learn that empire building doesn't always start in glass towers. Sometimes it starts in grease-stained garages. That weekend, she walked into the kitchen wearing diamond earrings that caught the light like they belonged in a magazine. She tossed her purse on the counter and pulled an Aspen travel brochure from her bag. Richard says Aspen will be perfect for New Year's. Snowfall, champagne, the whole thing, she said, her eyes glimmering with excitement. I studied the glossy photos, fireplaces, ski lodges, couples holding hands against mountain backdrops. Then I looked at the diamonds swinging from her ears. Beautiful, I murmured, sipping my coffee. She mistook my calm for ignorance. Her lips curled into a satisfied smile. You should think about doing something for yourself too, Kevin. You deserve a little luxury. Luxury. The word echoed like a taunt. To her, luxury was champagne and diamonds. To me, luxury would be walking into Richard's boardroom and tearing his castle down brick by brick. That night, I placed the Aspen brochure in my manila envelope beside the jewelry receipt. I underlined the date, December 12th, circled on the company's shareholder calendar. That was the day of the annual meeting. The pieces were aligning. Still, there was one move left, securing allies. Buying shares gave me weight, but weight alone doesn't topple kings. Votes do. Glass connected me with two disgruntled former executives who still held small but significant shares. Men Richard had burned on the way up. We met at a dim steakhouse on the west side, the kind of place where cigars hung heavy in the air. They introduced themselves as Mark and Stevens, both in their 60s, both tired of Richard's arrogance. You're saying you own 12% already? Stevens asked, swirling his whiskey. I nodded. Enough to matter. Mark leaned forward. And you want us to side with you? I don't want you to side with me, I corrected. I want you to side with the truth. Richard is draining this company dry. If he keeps running it, you settle lose everything. If we act together, we can force change. The men exchanged a look. Then Mark chuckled. You know, you sound less like a mechanic and more like a man whose sepid's been waiting for this his whole life. I didn't deny it. By the end of the night, both men had agreed to support me. Together, our combined stake was just enough to rattle Richard's throne. Back at home, I walked into the garage, my father's Chevy waiting in silence. I placed the signed agreements, the wire receipts, and the Aspen brochure side by side on the workbench. Each paper was a weapon. I stared at them, then at my reflection in the chrome bumper. This isn't sept gambling, I whispered. This is restoration. I am restoring my name, and I to restore justice, no matter what it costs. The next morning, I kissed my wife on the cheek as she rushed out the door, her perfume trailing behind her. She didn't know that by the time she was sipping champagne in Aspen, her lover's empire would already be mine. She thought diamonds and ski trips made her untouchable. But diamonds cut both ways. Powerful men don't collapse all at once. They fracture first, tiny cracks, invisible to most, until the pressure makes them split wide open. By mid-December, I was watching those cracks appear in Richard's empire, and every one of them felt like a thread I could pull. It started with whispers. Frank, the accountant friend who first tipped me off, called one morning. His voice was low, urgent. Kev, I shouldn't even be saying this, but Richard Dett's been moving money between subsidiaries, transfers at odd hours, almost like he sits covering shortfalls. I gripped the phone tighter. You have proof? Not hard proof. But numbers, don't they? Look up their quarterly filings. Pay attention to deferred expenses. It sips smoke and mirrors. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after my wife went upstairs. The filings were public, pages and pages of jargon, but I circled line items with a mechanic's eye. Just like spotting a faulty carburetor, I saw the parts that didn't fit. Deferred maintenance costs climbing, revenues claimed but not collected, payments restructured. It was a shell game. I printed it all out, slid it into the manila envelope and underlined the date, December 14th, 2022. The next day, I asked Glass, my lawyer, about what I'd found. He leaned back in his chair, tapping the papers with one finger. You scare right. This is deliberate, not just sloppy accounting. Intentional manipulation. If we get someone inside to confirm it, this could sink him legally, not just financially. He paused, eyes narrowing. You sure you want to go this far? I didn't hesitate. He took everything from me. That's not stopping halfway. Glass nodded. Then you still need a whistleblower. Someone in his own house willing to speak. The thought thrilled me. Taking Richard down from the inside. Meanwhile, at home, my wife's arrogance was peaking. She strutted through the kitchen in fur-lined boots, Aspen brochures stacked on the counter. She hummed while cooking, laughed at her phone, and wore those diamond earrings like medals. One evening, she even said it outright. Kevin, she sighed, swirling wine, you don't best understand. Richard is a visionary. He sees things you never could. I smiled faintly, polishing the Chevy in the garage. Maybe you set right. She smirked, satisfied, and walked away. But what she didn't know was that Richard's vision was rotting from the inside. By December 16th, Donnelly, the private investigator, came through again. He handed me a thin black notebook across a diner booth. His fedora shadowed his eyes. What sep's this? I asked. Ledger. Got it from a contact in accounts payable. Shows off the book's payments. Bonuses, bribes, hush money. Adds up to $85,000 in the last quarter alone. I flipped through it, heart pounding. Dates, amounts, initials. One entry even listed Richard's initials directly. $12,400 wired on November 21st, labeled as consulting. Except the recipient was his brother-in-law, a man with no ties to the company. Donnelly lit a cigarette. Careful with this. Men like Richard don't play fair when they know you sip, holding their secrets. I slid the ledger into the manila envelope, my hands steady. Then it's a good thing I don't play fair either. At the same time, the tension around Richard began to show. At a shareholder info session on December 17th, I stood in the back, invisible among the suits. Richard strutted at the front, rattling off numbers with his usual arrogance, but his tie was crooked. His voice cracked once, and when a younger investor asked about debt ratios, Richard snapped harder than necessary. Do you run a company? No? Then sit down. Murmurs rippled through the room. The mask was slipping. I left before he saw me, slipping into the icy December night with a grim smile. The cracks were widening. At home, my wife's fantasy kept ballooning. She was already packing for Aspen, dragging suitcases into the hallway. New gowns hung in the closet, tags still on. She even bought ski boots despite never skiing a day in her life. I watched silently as she twirled in front of the mirror, holding a fur coat against her shoulders. You like it? She asked. I smiled. Careful. It suits you. She laughed, satisfied. Richard says I said I'll look perfect in the lodge by the fire. I bit my tongue. Not yet. Elaine stopped by that week. She found me in the garage, hunched over papers. She frowned at the growing stack in the envelope. Kev, this is eating you alive. You sure you can handle it? I looked her dead in the eye. I can just handle it. I have to win. She sighed, hugging me tightly. Then win, but don't lose yourself. Her words lingered as I slid the ledger into the envelope, underlining December 16th in red ink. The manila folder was thick now, almost bursting. Receipts, photos, texts, jewelry slips, Aspen brochures, filings, ledger, proof upon proof. The weight of it wasn't just paper. It was my marriage, my father's land, my entire life compressed into documents sharp enough to cut. On December 18th, I sat in the garage with the Chevy heater humming faintly. Snow fell outside, blanketing Oak Park in silence. I looked at the envelope, at my reflection in the chrome, and said the words out loud. They think Aspen is the climax. But the real avalanche is coming. I tightened my jaw. On December 12th, in that boardroom, I just owned shares. I said I'll own the truth, and truth, once spoken, can be buried. December 12th, 2022. The date circled in red ink for weeks finally arrived. Chicago was locked in an early winter freeze that morning. Ice clung to streetlights, steam rose from manholes, and every breath I took clouded in the air like smoke. But inside me there was no frost. There was fire. I wore a dark suit that had hung untouched in my closet for years. A mechanic's hands don't belong in tailored sleeves, but as I buttoned the jacket, I realized those hands weren't just for polishing chrome anymore. They were for signing names that could move empires. The Hyatt's ballroom, rented for Cold Dynamics' annual shareholder meeting, gleamed with chandeliers and velvet drapes. Rows of chairs filled with investors, board members, analysts. Waiters moved discreetly with coffee and pastries, the scent of roasted beans mixing with the sharp tang of tension. Richard stood near the podium, radiant in his arrogance. His wife, my wife, hovered beside him, diamonds catching the light. She looked like she belonged in that glittering room, a queen in a borrowed castle. She spotted me as I walked in. Her smile faltered just for a second before she masked it. She whispered something to Richard. He glanced at me, smirked, and turned back to the board as if I were nothing more than a mechanic who had wandered into the wrong room. That smirk fueled me. The meeting began. Richard took the podium, his voice booming. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Cold Dynamics continues to thrive under strong leadership and bold vision. He clicked through slides, revenue charts, market forecasts, expansions. His words flowed like oil, smooth and slick. But I could hear the cracks underneath, numbers that didn't add up, projections built on air. I sat silently in the third row, manila envelope on my lap. Every time he bragged, I felt the weight of those papers pressing into my hands. Receipts, transcripts, ledgers, transfers, truth waiting to be unleashed. Finally, the floor opened for questions. A few minor shareholders raised concerns about debt levels, deferred expenses. Richard brushed them off with a laugh. That's why you trust leadership. We handle the heavy lifting so you don't have to. He was about to move on when I stood. The room quieted. Heads turned, Richard froze mid-sentence, his jaw tightening. Kevin Malone, I said clearly. My voice didn't shake. Shareholder and I have questions. Murmurs rippled. Richard forced a smile. Mr. Malone, you were mistaken, shareholder. I stepped forward, manila envelope in hand. As of last week, I hold 12% of Cold Dynamics. Enough to have my voice heard, and my first act is to expose the rot You've been hiding. Gasps spread through the room. Richard Sepp's face flushed crimson. This is absurd. Security. I slammed the envelope onto the table at the front. Papers spilled out, the ledger, the jewelry receipt, the Hyatt bill, the share transfers. Absurd? I said, locking eyes with him. This ledger shows $85,000 in fraudulent payments last quarter alone. This receipt proves you've been funneling money through company accounts for personal use. And these share certificates prove you no longer control the company uncontested. I turned to the board, holding up the printed filings. Deferred expenses climbing, shell transfers at midnight. This isn't set leadership, it's SET's theft. The room erupted in murmurs. Reporters scribbled, investors leaned forward. Richard Sepp's composure cracked. He slammed his fist on the podium. Lies! He Sepp's a grease monkey. Nothing more. You think a mechanic can buy me out? You think you can own me? His voice rose to a shout. This man is a fraud. He doesn't set belong here. My wife's hand tugged at his arm, her face pale. Richard, calm down, she whispered, but he shook her off violently. I stayed steady. As of this morning, I am the second largest shareholder of Coal Dynamics. And with the proxy votes I hold, I gestured to Mark and Stevens in the back, who nodded. I have the controlling interest. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face twisted. He grabbed the papers off the table, hurled them to the ground, and lunged at me. For a second, time slowed. The chandeliers glimmered, the investors gasped. My wife's earrings swung wildly as she screamed. Security swarmed, pinning him back. His voice cracked as he shouted, "This company is mine, mine." But no one believed him anymore. I picked up the papers calmly, dusted them off, and set them back on the table. Then I looked directly at my wife. You wanted power? Here it is. Her face drained of color. She swayed, clutching her handbag as if it could anchor her. The board chair cleared his throat, voice unsteady. Effective immediately, Richard Cole is suspended pending investigation. By proxy majority, Kevin Malone will serve as interim CEO. The words hit the room like a gavel. Final, irrefutable. I straightened my jacket. Thank you. This isn't cessed about greed. It's cessed about restoring integrity. Coal Dynamics deserves better than lies. Flashbulbs burst as reporters swarmed. Investors whispered. Richard screamed against security's grip. Veins bulging. My wife, she just stared, mouth open, her castle of champagne and diamonds collapsing around her. I walked out of that ballroom slowly, deliberately. Each step echoed louder than Richard's shouts, louder than her sobs. The icy Chicago wind hit my face as the doors swung open, but inside me there was no chill. There was clarity. I had walked into the Hyatt as the man she mocked. I walked out as the man who owned the castle she tried to climb. And for the first time in months, my hands didn't tremble. The Hyatt's glass doors slid open, and the December wind cut across my face like a blade. Reporters shouted questions, flashes popped in the gray morning light. But I kept walking. I didn't look back. The sound of my shoes against the pavement felt louder than their voices. Each step was deliberate, like I was leaving behind the man who once doubted himself, once begged for scraps of love from a woman already gone. But then I heard it. Kevin, wait! Her voice cracked through the chaos, sharp and desperate. I turned. She was running across the icy pavement, her heels slipping on patches of frost. The diamonds she wore to flaunt Richard's wealth now dangled crookedly, her mascara streaked down her cheeks. She looked nothing like the polished queen who had walked into the ballroom beside him. She looked human, broken. Please, Kevin, she gasped, clutching at my arm. Don't do this. We can fix it. We can. I held her gaze, steady and cold. Fix it? You didn't want to fix it when you were in Aspen brochures and diamond receipts. Her lips trembled. It was a mistake. I was lost. You... Seth's always been the steady one. I see that now. Please. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. From inside my coat pocket, I drew a thin stack of papers. I placed them gently in her hand, not like a gift, but like a verdict. She looked down, blinking at the heading. Divorce petition, filed December 11th, 2022. Her knees buckled. She leaned against the hood of a silver Mercedes in the lot. Richard Sepp's, I realized with grim satisfaction. The same car he had once bragged about at a cocktail party, saying, "A car says everything about a man." Now it was a prop for her collapse. Kevin, she whispered, tears freezing against her skin. Don't do this. We can make it right. Richard, he doesn't matter. You matter. I shook my head slowly. I mattered when you laughed at me. I mattered when you called me boring. I mattered when you spent his money while I worked myself raw. But you didn't see it then, and now it sets too late. She sobbed harder, her shoulders shaking. Mascara dripped onto the divorce papers as her hands clutched them. You thought money was love, I interrupted. You thought diamonds meant security, but diamonds cut both ways. Her sobs echoed through the parking lot, mingling with the sound of shutters clicking from reporters who had followed outside. She realized it too. The humiliation wasn't private anymore. Her collapse was public, just like my humiliation had been when I found that receipt. Kevin, I sep been begging you, she whispered. I sep it'll change. Please don't leave me like this. I stared at her for a long moment. For 25 years I had carried the weight of our vows, of loyalty, of sacrifice. And now, in this frozen parking lot, I felt that weight slide off my shoulders like snow falling from a roof. You didn't lose me, I said softly. You gave me away. Her sobs turned into a hollow silence. She slid down against the Mercedes, clutching the divorce papers like a lifeline that was already slipping through her fingers. I turned and walked away. The cameras followed, but I didn't care. Their flashes weren't for Richard anymore, and they weren't for her. They were for me. The man who had walked into the boardroom invisible and walked out as the one holding the hammer. I didn't look back. Not once. The cold air bit into my face as I reached my car. For the first time in months, I breathed freely. The weight was gone. The past was behind me. And justice had finally stepped into the light. The boardroom was only the beginning. Real collapse doesn't happen in a single moment. It unravels piece by piece like a sweater pulled from the wrong thread. By December 15th, Richard Cole's name was plastered across every business headline in Chicago. Cole Dynamics under investigation for fraud. Luxury empire built on lies. Shareholder coup rocks corporate giant. His face, once smug and untouchable, stared out from glossy photos now framed with words like embezzlement and suspension. The $85,000 fraud ledger I handed over became front-page evidence. The jewelry receipts, the Hyatt bill, the financial filings. They weren't just scraps in my envelope anymore. They were exhibits in a case that regulators picked apart with surgical precision. Reporters swarmed the Hyatt lobby, camped outside his office, even followed him into court for questioning. Each time Richard's mask cracked a little more. One evening broadcast showed him shoving a microphone aside, screaming, "It's all lies," as cameras caught the sweat glistening on his temples. The mighty king had become a public fool. And then there was her. My wife Sep's collapse was quieter but no less brutal. Photos of her sobbing in the Hyatt parking lot had gone viral online. Comment sections were merciless. Gold digger gets what she deserves. Should Sep stuck with the man who loved her? Neighbors in Oak Park whispered. Friends she once bragged to stopped answering her calls. The diamond earrings she flaunted weeks earlier now looked like shackles, heavy reminders of a fantasy that had crumbled overnight. One afternoon she showed up at the house while I was in the garage. She didn't come inside. She just stood at the edge of the driveway, clutching a folder of papers. Her response to the divorce filing, her voice was barely audible. Kevin, I don't have anywhere to go. I wiped grease from my hands, looked at her and said simply, "That Sep's not my problem anymore." Her tears came again, but this time there were no cameras, no reporters, just two people standing in the cold December air knowing the life they built had already burned to ash. Inside the house, the silence was different now, not heavy with suspicion, not laced with betrayal. Clean, quiet, mine. Meanwhile, Cole Dynamics moved fast. The board issued a press release appointing me interim CEO until further elections. It was surreal, me, a man who spent his life under hoods of Chevys, now sitting in a skyscraper office overlooking the Chicago skyline. But I didn't chase the title for glory. I chased it for justice. And now that justice was here, I wore it like armor. Still, the cost wasn't lost on me. I sold my father Seta's land, burned through my inheritance, risked everything. At night, I would sit in the garage, staring at the empty spot on the workbench where the deed used to sit, and whisper, "I hope I made you proud, Dad." Elaine visited often, bringing homemade meals, reminding me I wasn't set alone. One evening, as we sat with coffee steaming in the cold garage, she said softly, Kev, you look lighter, for the first time in years. I smiled faintly, because I said not carrying their weight anymore. By Christmas, the fallout was absolute. Richard was indicted on charges of fraud and embezzlement. My wife had moved into a small apartment downtown, far from Aspen ski lodges and diamond boutiques. Her calls dwindled until they stopped altogether. The world that had once humiliated me was now collapsing under its own greed, and I didn't have to lift a finger anymore. The truth was doing the work. But revenge isn't just about destroying the guilty. It's about restoring the betrayed. So I turned back to the one thing that had been waiting for me all along, the Chevy. On December 26th, snow piled high outside, I rolled up my sleeves and went to work. The hum of the heater, the clink of tools, the smell of old oil, it was therapy. With every bolt I tightened, every chrome piece I polished, I felt like I was rebuilding myself. The papers, the evidence, the collapse, they were behind me now. Ahead was restoration. And as I stood in that garage, hands greasy again, I realized something. Richard lost his empire. My wife lost her illusions. And me? I found my strength. Fallout had stripped everything bare, and in that emptiness I discovered clarity. The storm had passed. Richard was indicted. My wife was gone. The headlines had quieted. The lawyers moved on, and for the first time in months, the house didn't feel like a battlefield. But the garage, that was where the real ending waited. On January 3rd, I rolled up the steel door and let the pale winter light spill across the concrete floor. The Chevy Bel Air sat there under its tarp, patient, loyal, unchanged. The same car my father left me, the same car I had ignored while chasing bills and fighting betrayal. I pulled the tarp back slowly. Chrome gleamed faintly under the dust. The leather seats cracked with age. My father's scent still lingered in the fabric, oil, tobacco, a hint of aftershave. I dipped a rag in polish, pressed it against the hood, and began to move in slow circles. The sound was soft, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. With every sweep, the dust lifted, and my reflection grew clearer. For months I had stared at this car and seen my failure. The man mocked as boring, too old, polishing old cars while others built empires. But now, as the chrome brightened, I saw something else. A man who had lost everything, risked everything, and still stood. The heater hummed in the corner, filling the silence. I thought about the land I sold, the inheritance I gambled, the nights I drank bourbon staring at the receipts. I thought about the courtroom Richard would soon face, the cheap apartment where my wife now lived. And I thought about my father. His words came back clear as day. A man should always keep something worth restoring. I whispered back. I did, Dad. I kept myself. The Chevy's chrome shone like a mirror now, and in it I saw not the man she threw away, but the man I had always been, loyal, strong, unyielding. I set the rag down, stepped back, and let the moment settle. This wasn't revenge anymore. Revenge had been the fire that carried me here. But polishing the Chevy, breathing in the smell of steel and oil, I realized what it had all become. It was justice. Not loud, not cruel, just steady. I ran my hand across the hood, the surface smooth and clean, and said the words that had waited inside me since the day I found that hotel receipt. You didn't lose me. You gave me away. The heater hummed. The snow fell outside, and in that quiet garage, surrounded by the echoes of loyalty and betrayal, I finally felt whole again. Justice doesn't end in the boardroom. It spreads. It seeps. It takes root in headlines, courtrooms, whispers, and the silent judgment of 1,000 strangers. By January 10th, Richard Cole wasn't just a disgraced CEO. He was a spectacle. Television anchors recited his name with a kind of venom once reserved for corrupt politicians. Coal Dynamics scandal deepens. Federal investigation expands. Stock tickers ran his downfall across the bottom of every financial channel, red arrows plunging like daggers. I didn't have to chase revenge anymore. The world was doing it for me. Elaine called one evening, her voice trembling with awe. Kev, you set her on the news again. They set her calling you the shareholder who saved the company. I chuckled softly, polishing the Chevy Sep's mirror in the garage. I didn't save anything. I just stopped a thief. But still, the words reached me, saved. For months, I had felt like a man drowning. Now people whispered about me as if I were a lifeline. Richard, meanwhile, was drowning fast. Court documents revealed more than even I had expected. Millions hidden offshore, fraudulent invoices stretching back years, entire shell companies built on sand. His lawyers tried to spin it, to paint me as an opportunist, but the evidence was undeniable. The $85,000 ledger alone was enough to crush him, and the rest was just gasoline on the fire. I watched one hearing on television. Richard, once immaculately groomed, now sat in a wrinkled suit, sweat glistening on his forehead. When the prosecutor read out the jewelry receipts, the Aspen trip charges, the fraudulent transfers, Richard slammed his fist against the table. "This is character assassination," he shouted, face red, veins bulging. The judge silenced him with a gavel. Reporters scribbled furiously. My wife, no, my ex-wife now, wasn't spared either. Though she wasn't charged, the world judged her harsher than any courtroom. Viral videos replayed her collapse in the Hyatt parking lot. Neighbors whispered. Former friends cut ties. She had gone from queen to pariah in less than a month. I heard she pawned the diamond earrings. I didn't ask, didn't care. For me, the noise was distant. I wasn't chasing applause or pity. I was chasing peace. In the garage, the Chevy gleamed brighter each night. Piece by piece, I restored it. A new carburetor, fresh upholstery, chrome polished until it caught the light like liquid silver. It was more than a car. It was proof that restoration was possible, even after betrayal. One afternoon, as I tightened the last bolt on the engine, my son Michael stopped by. He was home from college, taller than I remembered, his eyes filled with quiet pride. "Dad," he said, running a hand along the Chevy Sep's hood. "I saw everything online, the news. People are saying you stood up to giants. You took back what was yours." I looked at him. Really looked. I didn't said do it to be a giant slayer. I did it so you know what to do when someone tries to take everything from you. He nodded, eyes glistening. "You taught me that strength isn't said about yelling the loudest, it's said about standing the longest." His words struck deeper than any headline, because revenge wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the legacy I left him. Meanwhile, Richard's empire collapsed entirely. By February, Coal Dynamics had restructured. Investors rallied behind new leadership, and Richard's name was struck from every official record. He faced trial dates that stretched into the horizon, his fortune frozen, his reputation shredded. The man who once smirked at me across a boardroom now sat behind barred windows, waiting for a sentence he couldn't bribe his way out of. And my ex-wife? She faded into obscurity, living in a one-bedroom apartment downtown. No Aspen, no diamonds, no champagne by the fire. Just silence. The same silence she once forced on me. But for me, silence was different now. It wasn't emptiness. It was peace. One night, as snow fell softly outside, I stood in the garage with the Chevy fully restored, heater humming. I thought about the chaos still unraveling in courts and headlines, about Richard shouting at judges, about my ex-wife staring at pawn slips, and then I thought about the simple fact that none of it mattered anymore, because justice had already been served, and I didn't need to raise my voice. The world had spoken for me. By March, the noise of scandal had dulled into background static. Richard's trial loomed, my ex-wife vanished into her small apartment, and Coal Dynamics moved on under new leadership. The world spun forward, but in my garage, time slowed. The Chevy Bel Air was finally complete. Fresh paint gleamed under the lights. Chrome sparkled like liquid fire, and the engine purred with a steady heartbeat. For months that car had been my mirror, dusty, broken, abandoned. Now it stood restored, every curve and line alive again. On a crisp Saturday morning, I slid behind the wheel. The leather seat cradled me, firm but familiar, like my father's hand on my shoulder. I turned the key. The engine roared to life, smooth and powerful, shaking the garage with its promise. For a moment I sat there, letting the sound wash over me. This wasn't just a car, it was my father's legacy. My survival. My proof that even when betrayal rips you apart, You can rebuild stronger. I rolled down the driveway slowly. The neighborhood hushed under the pale spring sun. Oak Park looked different from behind the wheel of that Chevy. Houses I had passed for decades now gleamed like milestones. Every corner carried a memory, dropping Michael at school, walking hand in hand with the woman who was now just a ghost. People turned their heads as I drove past. Some recognized me from the headlines. Some just admired the car. I didn't wave, didn't stop. I let the Chevy speak for me. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Not the broken man who once whispered in a bourbon haze, "Was I never enough?" Not the man who trembled holding a hotel receipt. Not the man mocked as boring. I saw the man who stood his ground. The man who sold his father's land, risked every dollar, and walked into a boardroom to take back his life. The light turned green. I pressed the pedal. The Chevy surged forward, smooth as a promise. As I crossed the bridge out of Oak Park, I whispered to the wind, to my father, to myself. A man should always keep something worth restoring. The words hung in the air, true now more than ever, because I had restored more than a car. I had restored my name, my dignity, my peace. And as the engine carried me down the open road, I thought of the final truth, the one I had learned the hard way. You didn't net lose me. You gave me away. The Chevy roared, the road opened, and for the first time in years I felt completely free.